Jeffery Robinson, I think it was 2 years ago, edited a book, but it was published 2 years ago, called Poems of the Millennium 3. And it's the first time that systematically it's been claimed that the ways in which the British poets and literary establishment have tried to sideline and call Romanticism defunct are all baseless. This is a book of about 500 pages. 900, yeah.
It's how big the type is.
What's that for?
With an extremely unusual compilation of romantic work, especially in prose, with a reasoned structure, a magnificent introduction, and it really makes a sort of explosive clearing in the way people think about romantic poetry. That's for me. He has been professor of English in Boulder, Colorado, University of Colorado, Boulder. He's currently professor at Glasgow University. He wanted me to mention an earlier book called Unfettering Poetry, the fancy in British Romanticism, which obviously chooses to study what Coleridge called secondary, that it's fantasy rather than imagination. So over to you, Jeffrey. I understand that towards the end we'll be getting into some of the texts and we can start actually interchanging ideas around.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to Holly and Alex for this. First of all, how many of you have read, studied Romanticism in its standard versions? Okay, so you kind of know Elizabeth and Coleridge and Keats and Shelley and so forth. Good, because there'll be quite a bit about them along the way. It's a fairly, I should say, it's a fairly long paper. And as Will said, the end of the paper becomes you, more or less. That is to say, I want to look with you at some of the, I think I call them romantic exercises. They're at the end of the selection. We won't get to, many of the other selections, although I'll be asking you to turn the page from time to time. So, actually, if you don't have a copy of it, maybe you should give somebody else. Look on, right? Okay. I'm going to consider some of the ways that Romanticism as an early 19th century innovative poet has affected innovative poetry in the 20th century and now the 21st. I'll be talking about Romanticism proper, and hope that you'll be able to help me make connections to the present. My major question to which I hope you'll have some answers or responses is, how useful do you find the principles of an innovative or active Romanticism for your own work or for that of contemporaries, or those who you're studying? So here are the principles. I'll lay them out at the beginning and then I'll be cycling back to them throughout. One, that romantic poetry is a response in poetry, direct or indirect, to a perception of an untenable social condition of inequality and oppression. Two, as such, the response can occur and does occur at any point over time. In other words, the history of traditional romantic literary history locates it very rigidly within the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. But as Will was saying, Poems for the Millennium 3 pushes that from the middle of the 18th century all the way up to 1910. And it was only the University of California Press said we couldn't go over 918 pages. So we stopped. But it kind of kept going. The third principle, the importance of the lyric subject, the lyric I. We all know that. But however, not as a dominant, disinterested, overwhelming presence, but as an active participant, both in the social, but also in poetic poetic construction. And finally, related to that last in particular, Romantic poetry's expression is a derangement of form or innovative kind of poetry and or language. The title of the workshop derives from the premise of the third volume of Poems from the Millennium, called the University of California Book of Romantic and Post-Romantic Poetry, and includes as one of its epigraphs the following from André Breton, the surrealist. Romanticism asserts itself as a continuum. This is a great short sentence. Romanticism asserts itself as a continuum. The romanticism he refers to is a movement of, or a vision of innovative poetry that, unlike what a recent prominent anthologist of romantic poetry asserts, that it existed, quote, only for a brief period, unquote, in fact continually reinvents itself. And that's part of its radicalism. I will focus primarily on British Romanticism as a paradigm for contemporary innovative poetry and as occasioning the conflicts emerging from it. And we'll divide the presentation into 4 parts. The first part, I realize at the beginning of this is full of bullet points and numbers, like that stuff. The first part is a kind of a definition of radical romanticism and liberal democracy. Second part, and this is a rather long section, longer than I thought it would be, called Resistance to Radical Romanticism Over Time, where I show that it really starts with the poets themselves and never stops. Preparing for this workshop, in fact, has brought home to me how intrinsic the resistance to radical romanticism has been from the beginning of the 1790s. The third section will be called Subjectivity, Mind, and Self in Romantic Poetry, and Will had asked me to consider this area as being central to poets writing today as well. And finally, and again, here's where you come in, I'd like us to look at some of the romantic experiments in poetry that are handed out in the back that offer paradigms of poetic activity that I think carry through to the present. But first, I'd like to quote from the introduction to Poems from the Millennium, Volume 3, because I think it sort of states in sort of manifesto-like language the point of it and what we're doing tonight. The 19th century begins again. Nationalism, colonialism, and imperialism, ethnic and religious violence, growing extremes of wealth and poverty all re-emerge today with a virulence that calls up their early 19th century versions and all the physical and mental struggles against them, struggles in which poetry and poets took a sometimes central part. With these dire connections to the 19th century, we can see, as an instance of that mental fight, a linking of the experimental romanticism to its modern and postmodern counterparts. In poetry, the struggle occurred, as it did in the century that followed, as convulsive unfetterings of the imagination, presumed to be restricted by the powerful hegemonies of industrial capitalism and philosophical, political, and religious orthodoxies. Appearing in the first decade of the 21st century, when the threat, both east and west, of re-emerging religious fundamentalisms are in direct conflict with liberatory poetics, as the book will present them, Poems for the Millennium, Volume 3 becomes, in our view, an instance of an imagination resisting, in Blake's phrase, the mind-forged manacles of tyranny over nature and over the human mind and its freedom. In its own terms, our volume calls for a reawakening to the boundary-breaking impulse in the poetry of the 19th century, as it can still come down to us. A romanticism not consoling and formally traditional, as it has too often been described, but inherently transgressive, aggressive, and increasingly experimental. Okay, so now let me turn then to a very brief summary of the relationship between the beginnings of British Romantic poetry with the French Revolution. And for some, this is a rather traditional way of locating the origins of Romanticism, but I don't think people have talked about it in terms of innovative poetics at all, frankly. So this is a period, and I'm talking about the 1790s in England, when there's a great increase in interest in new voices, that is to say, voices of previously oppressed classes of people. And I'm sure you know that and are familiar with some poems that exhibit that. But when the poets put them together in traditional poetic form, you get the sense of something rather jarring happening, something that's unusual. A juxtaposition of what might be called the aristocracy of the poetic tradition with very unaristocratic materials. There's also a resistance to, in this poetry, to power and to dogma and to law. The poets are interested in the quality of strangeness. In the modern Russian formalist word, defamiliarization, which both words within Shelley in particular use this very language. Also, there's a great deal of interest in the concept of mystery and incomprehensibility, not as some kind of obscurity, but as what happens when you look at the real world in a strange way. And so you see both in English Romanticism and in German Romanticism, people talk a lot about mystery and incomprehensibility. Friedrich Schlegel has a little brief essay, which I think we include in the Poems of Millennium, on incomprehensibility. So with that in mind, I'd like to begin by reading, and it's not on your handout, Wordsworth's advertisement to the 1798 Lyrical Ballads, which is, I think, and the more I read it and think about it, one of the really great works of romantic, innovative poetry. And you'll see a little bit why it's sort of lost that status. Anyway, he said, the majority of the following poems are to be considered as experiments. I mean, he starts right out with that. So we're in new territory. They were written chiefly with a view to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purposes of poetic pleasure. Readers accustomed to the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers, if they persist in reading this book to its conclusion, will perhaps frequently have to struggle with feelings of strangeness and awkwardness. They will look around for poetry and will be induced to inquire by what species of courtesy these attempts can be permitted to assume that title. It is desirable that such readers, for their own sakes, should not suffer the solitary word poetry, a word of very disputed meaning, to stand in the way of their gratification. But that while they're perusing this book, they should ask themselves if it contains a natural delineation of human passions, human characters, and human incidents. And if the answer be favorable to the author's wishes, that they should consent to be pleased in spite of that most dreadful enemy to our pleasures, our own pre-established codes of decision. You could do any number of modern theoretical readings of this passage. I think that's kind of astonishing with a 28-year-old in 1798 who just put that together. So the pleasure that the reader should experience is conscious and indicates an apprehension beyond that of the familiar. The poem ought to stimulate the mind to see the world differently, but to recover a sense of the human that's lost in the duplicity of traditional poetic language. The juxtaposition of a customary sense of poetry within the new content is what he's describing here. And I should say, just moving away from this for a minute, that last year I was in Paris at the Musée des Carnavals. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a tremendous museum of Paris history. And they have a great gallery of paintings from the time of the French Revolution. In particular, the paintings of the royal family, and Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And if you follow them from the early ones to the late ones, you see a picture of the early ones, royalty, regal and unified, filling the entire frame. When you get to the ones where they're being sent to the guillotine, you have, first of all, they're in total disarray as figures. And his collar is open, these bodies twisted around, looking behind him, and so on. And sitting there, and this is in a number of the paintings, not in the center, but just a little off-center, is the guillotine, or what one English observer called the beheading machine. So you see what I'm saying? In other words, you have a painting in which you have very graphically, I think, the image of the strangeness and awkwardness of experiencing royalty, or the aristocracy, not only of persons, but of art, being confronted with this new reality. Okay, now we'll be coming back to versions of this all the way through, but what I'd like to do now is to begin with sort of the whole central section of the talk, really, which is a series of, and it could have been expanded enormously, a series of instances of the way that Romanticism, or the readers of Romanticism, have undermined over time its radical potential and led to, as Will was talking about, what has become a rather exclusive group of texts, and even more so, a kind of exclusive way of talking about the poetry itself. So, I'd like to begin with a poem that's on page 11 of your handout, if you can turn to. And I want to look at this in considerable detail because its entire history is, during Wordsworth's life, is, I think, kind of stunning. You have it there, Old Man Traveler. And I wonder if one of you would like to read it, including the title.
Yeah, sure.
Great, thank you. And don't be bothered by the bold face near the end.
Should I go on to the omitted bit as well? Should I read the bold bit as well?
Yes, yes, it's all one poem.
Yeah. Okay. Old Man Travelling, Animal Tranquility and Decay, a sketch. The little hedgerow birds that peck along the road regard him not. He travels on, and in his face, his step, his gaze, his one expression. Every limb, his look and bending figure, all bespeak a man who does not move with pain, but moves with thought. He is insensibly subdued to settle and quiet. He is one by whom all effort seems forgotten, one to whom long patience has such mild composure given. But patience now doth seem a thing of which it hath no need. He is by nature led to peace so perfect, that the young behold remember what the old man hardly feels. I asked him whither he was bound, and what the object of his journey. He replied, "Sir, I am going many miles to take a last leave of my son, a mariner, who from a sea fight has been brought to Falmouth, and there is dying in that hospital."
Thank you. Okay. First of all, just note the sort of multi-valent or multi-dimensional quality of the title. First, it refers to a particular person. Then refers to what is being seen as a kind of allegory in some way. And finally, a word that was quite popular during this period to describe poetry, but clearly with a visual association, a sketch. Right? Looking to be viewed. So, in the first part, that is to say, before the bold, Wordsworth originally in one of the manuscripts referred to it as the description of a beggar. But the way it sits here, it's a kind of an aestheticization or a fantasy of an aged man who returns to the dust, a privileged state of tranquility. Kind of an oxymoron, the human and the animal come together in this beautiful synthesis. But then there's this turn in which the lyric subject suddenly asserts himself as one seeking knowledge, and in the context of lyrical ballads, pushing into the domain of the other as subject, out of sympathy. The subject, in that sense, can paradoxically both aestheticize and engage as part of the social community. However, the old man's dignified response cannot be aestheticized or unified at the end. It becomes an example of what, and I'll refer to this later, the French very interesting thinker, Jacques Rancière, calls an example of non-art a juxtaposition that can't be controlled. What the poem reveals about the subject is true of romantic poetics in general. That the advent of a poetry of democracy meant to the poets that the lyric subject, the speaker, belonged to a non-hierarchical distribution of members of the democratic social community, and thus became a central presence in poetry, which Adorno recalls wonderfully in Minima Moralia, the subjective expression of a social antagonism. That's poetry being modern poetry. Now, this is just the beginning of the story of this poem. In 1815, this was published in 1798 in Lyrical Ballads, and I would say that it is not untypical of some of the best poems in that work, where you get a sense of the juxtaposition of two realities that can't be unified, can't be controlled in that sense by some kind of a lyric imagination. However, in 1815, after publishing another wonderful volume of poems, Wordsworth published his first collected poems in 2 volumes. And maybe it's 4, I can't remember. At any rate, interesting, and I think tragic things happened to this poem at his own hand. First of all, the title just became Animal Tranquility and Decay. Right? First thing. So you remove both the particular and also the sense of a visual field. Then, and this is the real shocking thing, he cut the poem off before the encounter with the old man. To me, this speaks volumes for the history of Romanticism right there. So it turns out that first part is 14 lines, so he turned what might be called a defamiliarized sonnet-bearing poem into an actual unrhymed sonnet of 14 lines, and removed the juxtaposition. So in a way, it becomes a kind of recovery of aristocratic form. The lyric subject, though undeclared rhetorically in this new version, appears as a unified, consistent consciousness throughout, not as someone who participates in a surprising event of consciousness. The new poem exhibits total control over the materials, and thus, in a sense, the subject observes what stands outside the world in which he moves. The old man is all object, idealized. Poem as description is elided, but the poem as fantasy, or aestheticized. It's no longer what is called a critical poetry. Then, if you look, to make this point, I just want to push this point a little further. If you look carefully at the manuscripts as well as the publication history of this poem, it begins, as I said, as a description just of those first 14, of the beggar, first 14 lines. Then at some point, and there's not a manuscript of this, but at some point before it was published in 1798, he added the encounter, okay? And then, over the next 15 years, at some point, he took it out again, okay? So, what can we say about that? Democratic poetics, the presence of non-art, the characterization of the lyric subject were very much an issue in his mind and represented a conscious choice, first entered upon, then recanted. So it's an example of Wordsworth's conscious poetics in that regard. Then one more point to make. Moving out from Lyrical Ballads further to the whole collection of 1815, he reordered, and he kept this order for the rest of his long life, his poems into categories, such as poems of the fancy, poems of childhood, poems of sentiment and reflection, and poems of old age. He included the poem in a section called Poems of Old Age. And he said very clearly in his preface that he had organized the poems this way, in the following, these words. The work, so that the work, the whole book, may more obviously correspond with the course of a human life, and for the sake of exhibiting in it the 3 requisites of a legitimate whole, a beginning, a middle, and an end, having also been arranged according to an order of time, commencing with childhood and terminating with old age, death, and immortality. So the entire oeuvre leaves the domain of the referent, the word, to get absorbed in that of the lyric subject. And the growth to maturity, which becomes a central preoccupation of critics, even more than poets, from that point up until tomorrow. you know, it's still with us. So he initiates the notion of the poet's life as a bildo, to be a feature of romantic poetry. And the collective or civic subject, which appears in the early version of Old Man Traveling, reverts to an individuated subject. I'll have more to say about that later. And more generally, you could say that the new way of ordering things, with reference to the lyric subject and human growth, obscures the radical import and effect of lyrical ballads. You know, it's gone. There is no lyrical ballads from 1859. They're just the individual poems scattered around the whole collection. Now, and this next part I'm going to do very quickly, but just as another instance of how in Romanticism itself you get this sort of depoliticizing of Romantic poetry, is the case of Shelley. Two of his most political works, one poetry and one prose, The Mask of Anarchy, which was written in 1819 after the so-called political Peterloo massacre, which you may have heard about, where a number of people were killed for non-violent protest. It was refused publication by his good friend and one would have thought radical Leigh Hunt, who's actually an extremely valuable and understudied figure in the Romantic period, because he was afraid of the political consequences of such a radical and in-your-face, action-oriented poem being presented at this time. Eventually, Hunt published it in 1832, 10 years after Shelley died, and right at the time that, for the first time in at least 2 or 3, maybe 4 decades, British society was experiencing a certain element of reform. It was the years of the Catholic Emancipation in 1829 and the Parliamentary Reform Bill in 1832, which had been bubbling over the preceding 8 or 10 years. So, and then Hunt, in his preface, says, plays down, we didn't really play down the radicalism of the poem, but he said, what's real important now is that you can see Shelley as a kind of prophet. But he shies, or I guess you'd say tries to rationalize his not having published it initially. The other thing I wanted to mention here, though, well, 2 other things. One is the defense of poetry, which I think is the greatest of all Romantic manifestos, and one can spend an entire session just on that. Was written in 1820, but it wasn't published until 1840. So again, sort of out of its time, and could be then thought of, as Shelley was thought of by 1840, as a great essay on lyric poetry for someone for whom a lot of people had a lot of nostalgia at that time. And then the final point I want to make about Shelley is that in 1824, or 2 years after his death, his wife Mary Shelley published what she called the posthumous poems of Shelley, which was a lot of had not been published during his lifetime. But in her preface, you get no sense at all that Shelley was a radical, a serious radical, who was hounded by the police, who was chased out of his country, and on and on and on, and who wrote really inflammatory poetry. She says, this is a quote, and this sort of permeates throughout the entire short introduction. His life was spent in the contemplation of nature, in arduous study, or in acts of kindness and affection. Now, all of those are true, but it kind of, shifts the emphasis from the main point. And this publication, I'm quite sure, becomes really the keynote for the vast majority of 19th century and early 20th century, or really up to the mid-20th century, versions of Shelley. reaching its 19th century peak in the disparaging, although not completely disparaging, remark by Matthew Arnold, which is very famous. Shelley is a, quote, beautiful and ineffectual angel, beating in the void his luminous wings in vain. So, I grew up on that one. I said, oh, that's interesting. So that's how you're supposed to read to a Skylark. So now, the next stage in the process of thinking about the Romantics and defanging them, so to speak, you can begin to see in that passage, in that line from Arnold, but also, we don't have time to look at it, but I strongly recommend that if you haven't already looked at it, look at very closely what T.S. Eliot says in the passage that I quoted here, and Michael Palmer, an American poet, a good American poet, says in what I think is a really good essay on Shelley. But the main point in, maybe we should look briefly at the Shelley quote, which is, it begins on page 1 actually of your anthology. I won't read it all, but just to make the point, which is that he does something that happens both within the Romantic period itself, not by the poets, but by reviewers, and again continues up pretty much to the present, which is there's a powerful need to exclude radical political thought from poetry, and particularly from innovative poetry of any sort. And that's what Eliot is all about here. Shelley both had views about poetry and made use of poetry for expressing views. And that last phrase, I think, says a lot for Shelley. Further down, the notes to Queen Mab express, it is true, only the views of an intelligent and enthusiastic schoolboy, but he took his ideas seriously. So, on the one hand, he's right. Shelley did take his ideas seriously, but he does something which is also very common in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is to slot Romanticism as an adolescent endeavor. And it happens over and over and over again. Words like immaturity, triviality, brevity, flights of fancy, all this kind of stuff appear again and again. I think the fullest treatment of that, actually, is by an American contemporary of T.S. Eliot, Irving Babbitt, in a book called Rousseau and Romanticism, which is pretty amazing. But a whole book could be written on sort of trashing the affect and the sort of fixation, as he sees it, of romantics as being immature, as wallowing in fantasy, wallowing in self-remorse and self-pity, and not doing anything. So, complete contradiction to the idea that the Romantics were attempting to write effectual poetry. But anyway, it's really good. So this passage is, and then Eliot goes on to say, I find his ideas repellent, and the difficulty of separating Shelley from his ideas and beliefs, which is a fascinating thing that he, as a poet of the early 20th century, feels it incumbent upon him to do, to figure out how can you admire the wonders of Shelley as a lyric, but shelving, bracketing all of this, these terrible ideas. And so, Michael Palmer's response to this is appropriate. I won't read the whole thing, but just on this last bit. What is most striking, of course, is the rage against Shelley's ideas. which one cannot but wonder, seemed to Eliot the worst. Shelley's feminism, his progressive egalitarianism, his ecotopic perspective, his idealism joined with an active interventionism, his atheism, his defiance of conventional amatory codes, perhaps all of you at any rate. But you can see, I think, in Eliot and also in Palmer's response, the intensity of the feelings around political radicalism and innovative poetic form, which is basically what the issues are about. Now, I'd like to turn next to, jumping ahead to the mid-50s, late 40s, mid-50s, and 60s, and really continuing on, although there will be some protests to this, which might be called the attempt to rehabilitate, totally successful attempt to rehabilitate the Romantic poets. And although you can find instances of this in the UK, I think most of the famous examples are, at this point, American. I'm thinking of people you've heard of: Lionel Trilling, N.H. Abrams, Harold Bloom, Jeffrey Hartman, and a couple of other American critics who weren't romanticists, but wrote about lyric poetry in the same way. Louis Martz, who wrote a very interesting book called The Poetry of Meditation about 17th century religious lyrics, and Robert Langbaum, who wrote a kind of analogous book about Victorian dramatic monologues called The Poetry of Experience. Interestingly, all of these critics were Jewish critics, writing just after World War II. I wrote a whole essay on that in this regard. They describe, and I'll give you the key passage now, they describe a type of poem that could be called a poetry of the drama of the lyric subject, which is basically, in poetic terms, what Wordsworth was trying to do with the sense of his whole poetic oeuvre, sort of a developmental business. It's also important to note, I think, that all these critics, in one way or another, were influenced by psychoanalysis, which in the United States was very big in the 50s and 60s. Not so much the classical psychoanalysis, which was an attempt to lift traumatic repression from childhood, but more the current version, that is 1950s version, which was called ego psychology, and which had more to do with helping a person to develop a fuller, more active, engaged sense of self in the world. So here's M.H. Abrams' classic description of what he called the greater romantic lyric, which includes poems like Frosted Midnight, the Aeolian Harp of Coleridge, Tintern Abbey of Wordsworth, which I think is probably would be called the favorite poet in the United Kingdom classroom, it seems to me. Poem, Tintern Abbey. Keats's Odes, Shelley's Odes, including Ode to a Westman, and poems like that. So Abrams said, these poems present, this is 1965, present a determinate speaker in a particularized and usually a localized outdoor setting, whom we overhear as he carries on. In other words, he's not speaking directly to us. It's not about engagement. We overhear, that's John Stuart Mill, that definition of lyric poetry is overhearing speech. These poems, whom we overhear as he carries on in a fluent vernacular, which rises easily to a more formal speech, a sustained colloquy, sometimes with himself or with the outer scene, but more frequently with a silent human auditor present or absent. The speaker begins with a description of the landscape. An aspect or change of aspect in the landscape evokes a varied but integral process of memory, thought, anticipation, and feeling, which remains closely intervolved with the outer scene. In the course of this meditation, the lyric speaker achieves an insight, faces up to a tragic loss, comes to a moral decision, or resolves an emotional problem. Often the poem rounds upon itself to an end where it began, at the outer scene, but with an altered mood and a deepened understanding, which is the result of the intervening meditation. The form of this poem corresponds exactly to the predictable movement of the meditation that implicitly, and in some poems less so, identifies, as he says, the lyric speaker with the poet. It is possible, so the poet, in other words, is not somebody who makes poems anymore. The poem has become one with the voice speaking of the poem. So there's no real agency of the poem. The poem is a figure of meditation, which I think is really important in terms of what we're getting at. Now, a lot of these poems are blank verse poems. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And I just want to mention parenthetically that one could describe the interest in blank verse monologues in the early Romantic period very differently, which I think is, and this is, I think is fair, is that they were constructions by the poets to mimic or imitate or represent the language of a citizen in a democracy, the speech, rather, of a citizen in a democracy, blank verse being more or less unrestricted. Right? There are no points of, there are no full stops, right, that are intrinsic to it, whether they are in a sonnet or in a stanzaic poem. So just as a counter interpretation of what might have been going on during that period. So I'm not going to spend any time rehearsing the rest of this critical history, but it is extremely interesting if you want to follow it. And it goes all the way up pretty much to the present, which in spite of the fact that, first of all, I haven't mentioned this yet, but unquestionably this is a male-centered tradition. I mean, all the poets that are listed in this greater romantic lyric category are men. There's been a tremendous rediscovery of women poets writing during this period. And I would have thought that that would have affected how the romantic poem was described. But it really hasn't. And if we had time, I could give you my own takes on what that would look like, because I've thought quite a bit about it. Anyway, new historicism, the actual bringing of history into relation to Romanticism has taught us a huge amount about what things meant during the Romantic period, but it hasn't altered this paradigm for reading the poem, which is the curious thing. Okay, so now to switch a little bit here. To go back into late Romanticism with the German poet and critic Heinrich Heine in a wonderful book that isn't read nearly enough about Romanticism, more or less contemporary with Romanticism, called The Romantic School. He distinguished between, and I really recommend it, between two paradigms making the case for a radical Romanticism. He's writing against what he sees as an idealist, even escapist impulse in Romanticism, one that attempts final closure or salvation either in the poem itself or in the Catholic religion, which is what at least a couple of the major German Romantic poets were. He distinguishes the work of Goethe, the god of early 19th century German literature, who just died a year earlier, in 1832, from that of Friedrich Schiller, 1759 to 1805, who, he says, quote, wrote for the great ideas of the revolution. He destroyed the bastilles of the intellectual and spiritual world. He helped to build a temple of liberty, that very great temple which is to embrace all nations like a single community of brothers. He was a cosmopolitan. Goethe's masterpieces, he continues, quote, adorn our dear fatherland as beautiful statues adorn a garden, but they are, after all, statues. You can fall in love with them, but they are sterile. Goethe's works do not beget deeds, as do Schiller's. A deed is the child of the word, and Goethe's beautiful deeds are childless. Heine later refers to his own contempt for the sterility of Goethe's writing, the sphere of art which he fostered in Germany, which has had a quietive effect on German youth, and which frustrates the political regeneration of the fatherland. So you get a sense of the different kinds of poetics concerned with here. Okay, now, and again, this is partly, the next section here is a function of a question that Will suggested I might think about. I think it's a good one. I'd like to turn briefly to the philosophical and psychological tradition that lies behind the modern insistence that romantic poetry is poetry of the self. The Romantics, as you probably know, often describe poetic success in terms of a mental faculty, the imagination. The word, not only important in Kant's 1790 critique of judgment, is central in English and Scottish accounts of mental processes in the 18th century. Just as Heine could divide romantic poetry into two groups with conflicting means and outcomes, so accounts of the imagination could find its proponents and its detractors. But it is clear that in the mainstream tradition of reading Romantics that I've just rehearsed, proponents of the imagination have silently equated ideal romantic poetry with the faculty of imagination itself, and not as an expression of a vulnerability to the world outside it. As you know, in British poetry, the most influential observations about the imagination, the most prestigious faculty among the Romantics, came from S.T. Coleridge in the Biographia Literaria, published in 1817. And here I'll quote some of the famous sentences. The poet diffuses a tone and a spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. This power, first put into action by the will and understanding and retained under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control, reveals itself, here's the famous phrase, in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. And another one, the imagination dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events, it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially dead. So everything is fed back into the subject, and the outer world is kind of epiphenomenal. These comments often are said to derive from the Kantian a priori synthesis in his critique of pure reason, which in many ways they do. But rather than explore that connection closely here, I want to look at the Coleridgean characterization of the imagination in the way that it has come down to us. The poet needs to try to control elements beyond him or her from a distance or a height, in spite of the fact that Coleridge himself rarely held to this characterization of imagination in his own poetry. And we have a great instance from one of Coleridge's notebooks in the Poems of the Millennium. They become a measure of good poetry in the Romantic tradition, namely the great Romantic lyric, in which poem and drama of the lyric subject are congruent. It implies the non-generative poetry that Heine finds in Goethe, and the opposite of which is the generative poetry of Schiller. A poetry of participation rather than of distance, and the one that aims and goes beyond poetry itself. And is challenged in the following passage on your handout on page 9, you look at it, from Shelley's preface to Prometheus Unbound. And I'm referring here largely to the language of reconciliation and restoration. This is Shelley. The Prometheus Unbound of Aeschylus, the one that you drew it from, supposed the reconciliation of Jupiter with his victim, Prometheus, as the price of the disclosure of the danger threatened to his empire by the consummation of his marriage with Thetis. Thetis, according to this view of the subject, was given in marriage to Peleus, and Prometheus, by the permission of Jupiter, delivered from his captivity by Hercules. That's showing on Aeschylus. Had I framed my story on this model, I should have done no more than have attempted to restore the lost drama of Aeschylus. But in truth, skipping down, I was averse from a catastrophe so feeble as that of reconciling the champion with the oppressor of mankind. So I think that sort of captures at least one way of describing the issue of what reconciliation means in political terms, and then in poetic terms. Shelley turns reconciliation into a choice for a poet with profound political consequences, in which he centrally involves himself through the rejection of an aesthetics of restoration or mimesis for an art that he hopes will reach out from the word to the deed. Moreover, Coleridge's dead objects do not exist for Shelley, where there are only subjects, in this case challenger and oppressor. And art where there are only subjects is the romantic democratic art. One assumes that the invocation of Kant as a source for thinking about poetic faculties would have to imply a poetry not of the deed but of the word alone and the self that produced it. However, recent criticism and theory have offered readings of Kant's third critique, the Critique of Judgment of 1790, and its revisionist successor, Friedrich Schiller's brilliant 1793 Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, that transformed the poetics of disinterested reconciliation with its romantic fulfillment in the seamless meditation of a lyric speaker into a domain of radical post-French revolutionary politics. All too briefly, Kant in his later critique, and Schiller following him, seek a faculty that can take a political position without being fettered by dogma or by a received version of social reality. Reason and understanding, as they see it, require a condition of interestedness that keeps the mind free in relation to reality and to law. Kant called this purposiveness without purpose, and Schiller called it the Spieltrieb, or play drive. This is not escape from the real world, but neither is it beholden to reality or ideology. Other words that might be used are reverie, or trance, or states that are conscious but aren't limited to, the issues that surround you, and are not, most profoundly, are not determined by them. This is not escape from the real world, but neither is it beholden to reality or ideology, and it corresponds to aesthetic political declarations on the British side. Maybe one of the most famous is Blake's I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. You know that one? Or from Shelley and Keats is in Shelley's didactic poetry is my abhorrence, and his war against what he considered the utilitarian narrowing of imagination that he called calculation. Keats' negative capability, or living in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Or, as he said in another letter, we hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us. Let's see here. Keats is moving the concern with mental faculties to a concern with form, poetry, as well as content, which recall Blake, who can say roughly with Kant, mental things alone are real, but then he gives a formal correlate, poetry fetters the human race. We can say traditional received poetic form and grammars exert a fettering, palpable design, and experiments with form in response to social realities and the law are the manifestation of the play drive. Jacques Rancière has argued the case for Schiller in this regard in terms of the democratic poetics, that the play drive, a kind of promiscuous, undistinguishing faculty of apprehension, produces what he calls the distribution of the sensible, which is a kind of acknowledgement and apprehension of everything that one encounters and is attracted to, rather than selecting them out. In art, this results in a juxtaposition of art, that which is received from the aristocratic traditions of art, and non-art, as we discussed before. Here we have a, shall we say, Kantian poetry of mind, not trying to reconcile or control or unify or finally exclude the elements beyond the self for the self, but rather one that participates amidst those elements, intervenes in them while acknowledging them as subjectivities. One might think about Kant's and Schiller's and later Walter Benjamin's use of the word reflection, which they associate with unfettered thinking that opens out to the referent with a possibility of an openness to contradictions. Okay, I'm skipping a little bit here. Okay, then two more main points. I will turn to the examples. I'd like to examine as another very important roadblock from academic criticism towards a radical romanticism, a crucial set of terms associated with the canonical analysis and judgment of romantic poetry: limits, failure, skepticism. Terms recently contested in ways that illuminate the radical romanticism and, in particular, possible roles for the romantic self. Since this poetry has been more or less equated with the drama of the lyric subject, which in turn equates to the poet, statements of apparent failure or observations about the limits to poetry are said to belong to the speaker, him or herself. So, when Keats says, "Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self. Adieu," to the nightingale, right? "Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is fain to do, deceiving elf." He is taken to mean that he now recognizes the limits of the visionary imagination in his failure to keep alive his connection to the nightingale as an enthusiasm of apprehension and possibility. But it is possible to look upon Keats's declaration in the Ode to the Nightingale and those of the other romantics, including I gave you an example from Shelley's great poem Epipsychidion, which has in it a quote-unquote failure of imagination near the end, written into the poem. I'd like to look at Keats's declaration and Shelley's as signaling the independent power of the other as subject in its limited availability to the sympathetic imagination of the speaker. Limited, not excluded, but limited. Going back to a poem like Old Man Traveler. To me, this is the most powerful point of the experiment that is lyrical ballads, that sympathy, and by extension poetic language, cannot and perhaps should not save someone less economically fortunate, that a poetry that attempts to reconcile two subjectivities will fail. It's not Wordsworth's or Keats's or Shelley's failure, but it's a statement about a triumphant democratic poetics, practiced, I might say, by one of the best of the women poets of the 1790s, Mary Robinson, who has a book called Lyrical Tales, which came out 2 years after Lyrical Ballads and is very clearly a response to it, and highly recommended. But she has a poem called All Alone, where she's speaking to an orphan that she encounters, and she said, "I can save you, I can make you happy, you're not all alone, you have me." And the last line is basically, "No, I'm all alone." And that's where it stops. So, again, that sense of trying to write a poem that allows the two realities to kind of exist. But you can see that as a quote, an example of failure. You see it all throughout Wordsworth's lyrical ballads. Another poem is "We Are Seven," or "The Idiot Boy, whose reasoning cannot be understood," or "Old Man Traveling." One ends up not with a poetry of unification or reconciliation, but of what Shelley called, in a really important line, somewhere in this collection of quotes about poetry, the before unapprehended relations of things. Jerome began, a critic you may have heard of, I think one of the very few critics of Romanticism who I think really speaks about romantic poets in interesting ways, poetics rather, in interesting ways. He sums it up, and this is on your sheet on page 6. From the point of view of romantic poetry itself, the theme of failure is simply the radical style for displaying the dynamic character of imaginative as opposed to cultured writing. The distinction between the two, between poetry and culture, is fundamental to any romantic art. One poetry gathers into itself a logic of failure. Once it solicits entropy, or what Blake calls Satan, as a source of life and energy, contradiction will define the system. Coleridge's balance and reconciliation of opposite and discordant qualities signals an effort to bring the new poetry under conceptual control. Okay, so finally, I'd like to turn to what we haven't really talked about yet, but is implied, and it's very important, and has to do with a radical romantic account of the lyric subject. It can be described in terms of a distinction between an individuated subject like you and me sitting in our solitude, or being in our idiosyncratic state, and the collective subject, where a person identifies fundamentally with a class of people in one way or another, or with something, or with myth, or with history, something outside of himself. I discovered just this afternoon, by coincidence, and I went there, I was reading about Blake in London, and it turns out, this is according to Ian Sinclair, who's a wonderful writer on Blake and on even more John Clare, that in the 1820s, both Blake and Clare lived, not knowing that each other did, in Fountain Court, a tiny little area, you probably know it, in Innsmouth Court, off of the Strand. I couldn't believe it, but they did. And Sinclair's point that this is sort of a wonderful coincidence. It turns out that Shakespeare's plays were performed there. I didn't know that. I mean, before they went to the Globe. So there's a kind of literary tradition. And then Dickens wrote part of Martin Chuzzlewit around that area as well. So there's this fascinating kind of literary connection. But I just wonder if Blake and Clare had a sense of themselves in the literary collective when they went to Fountain Court. It's sort of wonderful thing. I recommend you go and see it. There's a fountain there too. Okay, so the point here, I think, is that the Romantic poet, or the poet of the democracy, apparently had to identify with these other beings and these other realities. Couldn't simply write about it from a distance, or as it were from the armchair, or from a bourgeois perspective, even though they all, to some degree or another, were, except someone like Clare. And so that becomes a part of what they struggle with and what they write about. And I think it's really crucial to thinking about the romantic, sort of a revised notion of the romantic self. Because the whole idea of the greater romantic lyric is that it stays within the individuated self. Psychoanalysis, that makes that point as well, and so forth. But if you look on pages 8 and 9 for a minute, I want to read you a passage that from a poem that Alex asked me to look at. Which is Shelley's Ode to Liberty. And I just quoted here the first and last stanzas of a, as you can see, a rather lengthy poem. But just look how it begins. A glorious people vibrated again, the lightning of the nations. Wait, why don't you read this? Just read the first stanza. Sorry.
Sounds like...
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
A glorious people vibrated again, the lightning of the nations. Liberty, from heart to heart, from tower to tower, O Spain, scattering contagious fire into the sky, gleamed. My soul spurned the chains of its dismay, and in the rapid plumes of song clothed itself, sublime and strong. As a young eagle soars the morning clouds along, hovering in verse o'er its accustomed prey, till from its station in the heaven of fame, the spirit's whirlwind wrapped in, and the ray of the remotest sphere of living flame, which paves the void, was from behind it flung, as foam from a ship's swiftness, when there came a voice out of the deep. I will record the same.
Wonderful, thank you. And then that's what the next 17 stanzas do, is record the same. But notice how right at the beginning he says, suggesting that he's starting out as you might say, an individuated subject, but he hears this vibration from the people, and his comment about himself is, my soul spurned the chains of its dismay. And then, remember, Shelley's the one who talked about poetry as being the before unapprehended relations of things. And Shelley is an obsessed writer of similes. That is to say, before unapprehended relations. And I don't know if there's any documentation of this, but I can't help but wonder if surrealism got some of its fascination with juxtaposing images from far distances from Shelley's of simile. That would be interesting to look at. And notice just one other thing about this first bit here, how immediately his account of himself sort of shifts into a register of song and verse. My soul spurned the chains of its dismay, and in the rapid plumes of song clothed itself sublime and strong. As a young eagle soars the morning clouds among, hovering in verse, or its accustomed prey, which is very weird. Right? I mean, so you sort of have simile juxtaposed with, in some sense, well, with another juxtaposition of the bird and verse in a totally bizarre way, I think. And then the last stanza, beginning with the line before the last stanza, continues in the same manner. And the only thing that I'll mention here is that by the end of the stanza, he says, my song, its pinions disarrayed, might drooped, or it closed the echoes far away of the great voice which did its flight sustain, as waves which lately paved his watery way, hiss round a drowner's head in their tempestuous play. So the sense of the complete loss of this connection to this larger universe of the collective. But what's striking here, and again, very typical of Shelley at his best, I think, is that this stanza, even more than the first one, lists 4 or 5 similes in the course of describing the kind of failure, to use that word, of song at the end of this. So my point, I wonder if you agree with this, is that in a sense, the failure of song and the failure of the poet-speaker to sustain all of this is contradicted by the intensity, and very Shelleyan type, of intensity of continued poetic language, that is to say, similes. So, you see what I mean? I mean, the standard view of Romanticism is this kind of failure signals a kind of prosaic reality that is desirable, that is finally I've gotten out of this adolescent trance. You see what I'm saying? But if you really read Shelley's poetry, he'll allow for the failure part read in a different way, but that doesn't stop poetry from going, which gets, in a sense, back to Romanticism and asserts itself as a continuum. Then, before we turn to the final examples, I just want to read one of your contemporaries, who's the only one, I believe, who's in this selection of items, Sean Bonney, who appears
near the end.
okay, good. Which is this little essay he wrote called Letter on Poetics. Do you know this? I would think this would be, or at least this would be currency, right? I think it's kind of a stunning little work, this Letter on Poetics. But it also is a fantastic summary in his own idiom and in the present of some of the things I've been talking about. So if we just kind of read through it really quickly, you'll see what I mean here. Van Gogh hammered out his poetic program in May 1871, the week before the Paris Communards was slaughtered. He wanted to be there, he kept saying. In other words, it begins with reference to an event, a powerful, explosive event. The long systematic derangement of the senses, the eye is the other, he's quoting Crambeau here. He's talking about the destruction of the bourgeois subjectivity, yeah? That's clear, yeah? That's sort of what we've been talking about. Poetic, romantic poetics. That's his claim for the poetic imagination. That's his idea of what poetic labor is. Obviously, you could have read that as a simple recipe for personal excess. Again, emphasis on personal, but only from the perspective of police reality. Read the tradition of romantic criticism. Like, I just took some speed, then spoke the joint, and now I'm going to have a Pepsi. But that's not why I'm writing this, and it's not what it's about. The systematic derangement of the senses is the social senses, okay? And the I becomes an other, as in the transformation of the individual into the collective when it all kicks off. Okay? Then he continues talking about liberation struggles, about a third of the way down the next paragraph. It's simple social being it's simple. Social being determines content. Content deranges form, etc. I'm not quite sure what the etc. is, but those first two things seem to be exactly what I've been trying to talk about. Read Rimbaud's last poems. They're so intensely hallucinatory, so fragile. The sound of a mind at the end of its tether and in the process of falling apart. The sound of the return to capitalist business as usual after the intensity of insurrection. The sound of the collective I being pushed back into its individuality. The sound of being frozen to fucking death. Polar ice. It's all he talks about. Okay, I know that just drags us right back into the romanticism of failure and the poète maudit, that kind of gross conformity. And in any case, it's hardly our conjuncture, and so forth. So that's interesting to be interesting to unpack that phrase, dragging us back to romanticism of failure. And then the next little paragraph. Remember, most poetry is mimetic of what some square thinks is incomprehensible, rather than an engagement with it. It sort of goes back to Heine and Schiller. I don't know, I'd like to write a poetry that could speed up a dialectical continuity and discontinuity, and thus make visible whatever is forced into invisibility by police realism, where the lyric I, yeah, that thing, can be, one, an interrupter, and two, a collective, where direct speech and incomprehensibility are only possible as a synthesis that can blend ideas into and out of the limits of insurrectionism and illegalism. So there you have the poet becoming, and this I think may be the real thing that the standard tradition of romantic poetry and its emphasis on the lyric subject as a meditative instrument is concerned about, is the lyric subject as agent. Someone who really is attempting to change things, both in content and form. Okay, I know that's been long, but I'll stop with that. And we can both turn to your questions, and I would love it if we could look at least a couple of the romantic experiments. So, I don't know if people want to take a little break, or what's your usual?
It's more wide.
A little break.
A little break, okay.
Very simple.
Yeah. Going on the back.
Does it sound like the music as you know it, or is it familiar, or I'm just curious to know where it fits in.
It's certainly different to the Wu anthology, which is very probably the really
Yeah.
getting my topic.
Yeah. Actually, I quoted briefly from him on that just that phrase, romanticism lasted for a brief period.
Oh, yes,
That was from Luke. And, it's prefaced by saying something like, some would think that this isn't really fair, sort of like this. Some would think that the visionary optimism of romanticism, from our perspective, looks very naive.
yes.
And then he goes on to
like
say,
condescending tone.
it's a little condescending, even though, but that's the way phrase it.
I don't have much experience in studying or romanticism, but at the moment I'm just finishing a PhD and I've got a chapter on radio, and Adorno's lyric Poetry and Society was
Yes.
the radio address first, so I'm trying to kind of make it compatible, this idea of the address and this kind of claiming the lyric I as a kind of collective identity, or potentially collective. I'm trying to make that compatible with the idea of a radio broadcast, where you've got this kind of individual listening, but you're being quoted into an audience as well. So this has actually really helped me. Sometimes it's nice to just return back to, I don't know, this idea.
Often is there a address for radio?
Adorno did lots of his stuff as a radio address.
He's reading his
He was reading, the paper as a speech.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
So, but he did loads of stuff on radio. So, I mean, a lot of them were just, his stuff about pop music and that kind of thing. But that one's really interesting because it's got at the heart of it this question of the individual I, or the potential for kind of active.
I mean, he quotes Stefan George, how do you pronounce it? Stefan George, in that radio talk, Lyric Poetry and Society. And he says, okay, in Stefan George, there's no sense whatsoever of the social in the lyric eye of Stefan George's incredibly aristocratic and refined late romanticism. He says, okay, actually, that's precisely the mark of the social. It's very Adorno, but actually, you can imagine listening to the radio, Stefan Jorg, and he quotes a bit of a lyric, and you think, this guy who actually wanted to save the German language from vulgarity that was coming in with mass industrialization and the masses, and the murder of Liebknecht and so on, and of Rosa Luxemburg, all that German rubbish and mess, that had been going on, this guy's right, And then he says, well, actually, that's where the social makes its mark. Precisely in this I which completely excludes it. So the exclusion of the social and stuff for him is a force. It's actually, so this is the way you're reading romanticism. It's an antagonism of forces. We're not talking about literature as a sort of passive registry. Isn't it?
Right, absolutely.
So you've located us with French Revolution, Chartism, and so on and so forth. These are forces. And just as Adorno locates Stefan Jorg precisely was force at that point, isn't it? But obviously, most people wouldn't do that. They would just say, well, Stefan Jorg, this is very late romanticism. Obviously, the only way it can survive is by turning its back on everything and getting very kind of, what's the word, precious. And the next stage is irony, and the stage after that is cynicism, and the next stage after that is the poet laureate. You can't have it. It's a series,
It's really great.
So how to talk about force and poetry, to me, right, this is what you're...
Well, could we just look at one or two of these? Is 8 o'clock your firm? Everybody turned into pumpkins at that point? Or?
It's actually not run off, but we have got, the room is actually not booked.
We don't. I mean, we can stop them. But I'm just thinking. What if we just look at maybe two of the just so you could because they're and if let me just skim over a couple and then we can sort of open it up to some of the others. And I think what I said didn't make any sense at all. You'll be able to sort of extrapolate to these passages too in one way or another. But the first one by how many of you have read Charlotte Smith? She's one of the really great discoveries among women poets of the Romantic period. And her magnum opus is called Beachy Head, which is a long blank verse poem. Although it's not 100% blank verse. In fact, there's a lot of experiment in verse throughout that thing. And also the lyric subject just travels all over the place. The reason I picked this particular passage out, and I'll just mention something in it, and then you can look at it yourself later on, is first of all, it's in this long blank verse poem. Again, curiously, it happens to be 14 lines long. She wrote billions of sonnets and kept republishing them. They were very popular. But what I wanted to point out is a simple bit of syntax, which is. Notice that the passage, well, first of all, it's only one sentence long. It begins with I, and then with a strong affect-full verb, right? I loved to trace. And then the I vanishes. And what you get is a sentence that's all predicate, basically, after that. And there are other places in Romanticism where this occurs as well, probably throughout modern poetry, I would imagine. Clare is a major example of someone who can do this beautifully as well. But you know what I'm saying? In other words, if you think of a subject-centered poetry, you'd expect to feel the dominance of the subject in the sentence. But this is a sentence which is exactly the opposite of that. And you kind of wonder if it has something if there's a gender element in this as well. You know, that she sort of, in a sense, distributes her sense of the subject throughout in a way that makes you unaware of it. After a while, you get totally lost in these subordinate clauses and phrases, which keep evolving on themselves. It's kind of spectacular. Then the next example is a sonnet from the late sonnets of Clare, which are magnificent poems and very, very strange. You'll notice if you just scan this one that, and this is typical, that it's written in couplets. So a sonnet equals 7 couplets. Okay? So much for the hierarchy of the sonnet. You know what I mean? And interestingly, and I've done this, and I recommend it if you want to go on a wonderful field trip, so to speak. The Clare manuscripts are in the Peterborough Museum. Anybody been?
Yeah.
Have you seen them?
Yeah, fantastic.
Have you?
Yeah.
Fantastic. That is fantastic.
Quite an interesting analog to this, talking about sort of a radical continuum, is that when Prynne and Dawn started corresponding in the very early 60s, one of the things they really hit it off over were these manuscripts that Prynne would go to Peterborough to transcribe and send to Dawn over in space. Yeah. And they say that there's this whole thing about how, because they hadn't been published at that point,
right,
or broadened in any way, like Eric Robinson, it wasn't until I think the mid-60s, so slightly later, that he began to order it all. And there's this, they talk about the idea that writing is going on at this level, both in terms of the fact that he wasn't really aspiring to have it published in any way, but also the fact, as you say, there's this extinction of there's so many of them start, I love.
Yes.
And then there's just this sort of, there's no quality of sort of like reflection in there. It becomes like its own kind of labour.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's wonderful. That's really, really interesting too. Pretty adoring. In some of the manuscripts, I don't know if you saw any of these, but Clare was writing these sonnets on really thin paper. I mean, narrow strips, cheap paper. So much so that the second half more or less, of the 10-syllable line would have to be placed either above it or below it. So it looks almost like a tetrameter line, or an 8-syllable line. It's very strange looking. But in addition, in many cases, he'll blur the vertical space between sonnets. So if you just sort of sit there and read it, it looks like a poem, an heroic long poem, and never-ending poem. That is to say, a poem of aperture. It's open form. Kind of, it never stops. And that's what some of these suggest. So, but we might, with all of that, that's good. Why don't one of you read this poem? And then let's talk about the lyric subject matter. It's not the same as with Charlotte Smith. Anybody want to?
John Penn, Master's Nest.
That's just editorial.
I found a ball of grass among the hay and progged it as I passed and went away. And when I looked, I fancied something stirred and turned again and hoped to catch the bird. When out an old mouse bolted in the wheat, with all her young ones hanging at her teats. She looked so odd and so grotesque to me, I ran and wondered what the thing could be, and pushed the nappy bunch of where I stood. When the mouse hurried from the crawling brood, the young one squeaked, and when I went away, she found her nest again among the hay, and the water the pebbles scarce could run, and broad old sepals glittered in the sun.
Well, okay, to ask the plotting question, what's your thought about the lyric subject in this poem?
It doesn't exert any control over it. It's like as soon as that, as you say about Charlotte Smith, as soon as that first sort of affirmative verb is kind of out of the way, then it's like the reality is what comes to the foreground, whereas in a different sort of, with a different model of poetic subjectivity, it would be ordered and refracted and turned into a kind of, into a meaning, whereas here you get something which is, it's almost, well, it's experience, like there's no sort of intermediary between what's given to you.
It's just reactive.
Yeah.
I've often wondered, Shelley's, Wordsworth uses it too, the word apprehension, not comprehension, but apprehension, which I think sort of means a kind of conscious reacting to something. And you're kind of aware, but the reacting is fundamental to it. Now, the eye does pop up, right, from time to time. So what does it mean?
It's always in the perfect past. Sorry.
Well, that's it.
The occasion in the third line is quite intriguing. The repetition.
I
fancy.
Yeah, that is weird. That's great. Yeah.
It's like they're looking as then immediately superseded by whatever it is they fancy.
Yeah.
It's courage. Yeah.
But here it's done. But here, that's a really good observation. It really links fancy and looking.
Yes, it's like first it has to look, and then after that there's a maybe higher order process going on. But
Yeah. Maybe, or maybe it's just another one.
This isn't the low register, it's more like I just suppose.
Yeah, but yet it's important to remember that the word has a lot of currency, huge, far more than, it goes way back in the 18th century.
Yeah.
Very big word.
It's not an eye with a panorama or a perspective in front of it, or with an audience.
As we said in the 18th century, it's not a pleasing prospect.
Yeah, it's not a prospect at all.
Yeah.
It's immersed in the chains of speech, isn't it?
Indeed, the first Wordsworth poem looked at the old man, the animal, and then the sketch. It's like sort of three categories for a romantic poem. And then this one has just got the old man.
just kind of layers of stratification.
Yes.
What do you mean?
If in the Wordsworth, there you get the it's being addressed towards a direct subject, and then you get the reported encounter at the end. I mean, I don't think it's. I wouldn't go so far as to say. I mean, I certainly don't think Wordsworth is as, or Wordsworth prosody is stratified, not like it. Cooper is someone whose meditations are neatly stratified, whereas Wordsworth is much more like it, even in Tintin Abbey or the Prelude. It's much more eruptive. Is that?
So this is more closer to that then. That this is more eruptive too. Is that what you're clear?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's not. I guess there's nothing. Yeah, I mean, it's almost just sort of total experience.
Yeah.
What? Did you say? Total. Because I was thinking of Gertrude Stein. I've been reading Gertrude Stein.
It's almost like the I only really occurs when the narrative requires there to be an I. It's not like, you know what I mean? Like it's sort of distributed according to maps, almost. Like it's distributed according to the action.
Yeah.
And therefore, maybe it kind of requires an observer.
Yeah, I like the idea of it being immersed in the energy of the poem, that it's not standing apart or sort of marshalling the direction of the poem. It's almost, when the verb is given to it, it's so sort of congruent with what's going on in the poem.
It's like the I is continually undermining itself, because the I is there sort of linguistically. We have the first person pronoun, but we don't have a sense of the I, because the I is either undermining itself or allowing its uncertainties and anxieties to kind of overwhelm it constantly throughout. So we're always losing that sense of the I, and we're getting a sense of something else at the same time. We're getting scenes of what's happening with the mouse family.
Right. If you pursue that to be towards the end of the poem, there's something extremely strange that happens.
The I goes away.
The I goes away, but still Harry knows what's going on, right? Or
And then the last couple of...
How does it, can you read that? Is that beginning with and when?
And when I went away, she found her nest again among the hay. The water over pebbles scarce cover up, and broad all sex pools glittered in the sun.
I mean, that's, from one point of view, an impossibility, right? But it sort of reinforces the point, your point, I think, right? About the I is strangely inconsequential for perception, even. After the beginning of it.
It's kind of there as a kind of agent in the poem, but it's not there as a kind of, as a subject, as a kind of sense of self.
Yeah. Okay, let's look quickly at the next one, which is a translation of a poem by Friedrich Hölderlin, who's probably the major German Romantic poet in terms, not only for his own time, I think, but even more, I think, as a presence in contemporary poetry, modern contemporary poetry among poets. And in particular, people have been lately very interested in what are simply editorial fragments, quote unquote. That is, this little poem in the German edition is called a fragment, and there are a collection of them, and it's usually entitled "In Wälder" or "In the Forest." But this one has for a long time been one of my favorites because, let's see, what do you think? Paul, there are various, I'm not sure that, by the way, the word must is in the first line is correct. In German, it's möchte, which means desire or more. You know, there's a little more of that sensitivity. But at any rate, who'd like to read this? Okay.
I must build and erect new temples of Theseus and the stadiums and where Pericles lived. But there is no money. Too much was spent today. I entertained a guest, and we sat together.
1803. Okay, so what would you say is his impulse in the first half of the poem? You know, what's driving the desire to build the temples of Theseus and so on?
New territory in Europe that will be, let's say, in some way social utopia. Is it?
Okay.
It's territorial. in some way, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
Build, erect,
Yeah.
stadiums,
Monuments.
temples. Well, but Pericles, yeah, it's like, I mean, otherwise you write it into German nationalism. You don't want to do that, do you? You don't call it German nationalism. Or
Oh,
do you?
no. Oh, no, I don't think so. Not in 1803. I think.
No.
No.
So it's,
There's no mention of Germany, but I mean, yes, it's in what becomes that tradition, and it's sort of difficult to take it out of there. But
it's imaginary territory, isn't it?
yeah. And the territory, and it's typical of German romanticism, comes from the past, right? So it's
A mythic return. That this renewal also places emphasis on it being a renewal, on a refreshing of something
yes.
before it's not.
Yeah. And that was, I mean, the most, and I think this is fair, I mean, the most benign and generous reading of this side of German romanticism is the perception that the Greek past, both the Golden Age and the age of this, it's referred to here, the age of democracy, have virtues. They're worth bringing forward into the modern world. And it was a time, as it was perceived in the 18th century, where subject and object were not at odds with one another. There was no self-consciousness, all the rest of that. And part of the analysis of modern society by some of the most interesting thinkers, were concerned with the loss of that kind of thing. So, I mean, there's that, as I say, it's, I think, the most generous way you kind of bring that back in terms of renewal. And they wanted to renew that, and he wants to renew that. He's not in any way alone. So what goes wrong? Why doesn't it work?
Well, in the first bit, he's got this kind of grand ambition. It's alone. I mean, the eye is this kind of solitary thing, and then actually when it goes wrong, it's when he's in company with guests, and actually when there's more than one person, it's actually when it's
Wonderful. Yeah.
that's just it.
So he's kind of, I mean, in terms of the language we've been using before, he's sort of just a mere individuated self at the beginning, right? I mean, he's just somebody who wants to do this. But at the same time, it's a grand ambition, as you said, and it is territorial and monumental. I've often thought of it too as somehow at odds with on the one hand, he wants democracy, which is what every sort of progressive in the beginning of the 19th century wanted. He wants that.
It's not called to an assembly, is it? It's
No.
very,
It's making buildings
yeah.
or territories. So, but what sort of prevents him from going forward?
Socioeconomic reality.
Right. What Rancière would call non-art, right? So,
Have these grand ideas to fulfill these dreams and high, elevated, lofty ambitions for. It doesn't even say whether it's for humanity or himself, but then it's shit, I've got no money. Sorry.
Do you think so? I think it's his strength that he can actually write the two things within the same space.
Yes,
It's
it's
strength.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what you meant.
But it's the shift which is so noticeable. It's the descent.
You won't have to be cynical or strong to do that, don't you? I'm not constantly to be anything else. Because if you're serious about the first ambition, in some way, you might just think, oh well, no, forget it. Well, I don't think it is that, right?
It doesn't feel like the second bit is a failure of what the first bit. Too much money is spent. So that's almost like a celebration in a way. Not, I don't know. It doesn't feel like a failure.
I mean, he's doing what people accuse Shelley of not doing. That is, of actually perceiving what's in front of his nose in terms of his wife and his lovers and children and all those problems. I mean, it's this facile, actually cynical attack on Shelley. But there was a piece on the radio the other day, usual rubbish. Coming from Michael Frayn, playing about Shelley and all that rubbish. That's the cynicism, that's the weakness, isn't it? That's the lack of courage. I can see it as a lack of courage. I see it as strength. But I mean, people said he was mad, didn't they?
well, yeah, they said he was mad. Yeah, I don't know.
But perhaps that's a way of.
But then, he was said to be mad. Claire was said to be mad. Blake was said to be mad.
It's a way of.
And the rest of them died, except for Wordsworth, who kind of rolled on.
Yeah.
But that's not this. Yeah, it seems to me this is a great example of the kind of poetics that we've been putting forward, which is that you can imagine two other solutions. One would be to have it look as though it ended in failure, quote unquote. The other would be not to write that first part at all, keep them separate. But the poem manages both, and in a sense, one sort of allegorization, and the other poem's called Animal Tranquility and Decay. This could be called the discovery of real democracy or something like that. That is, or the embodiment of it in poetry. And you were saying that, kind of saying that before. That he kind of figures out that it's worth noting that it's sort of better to be two than one in a way in this situation. And you can imagine that poets. Another way to think of it too is it's kind of allegory of a transformation of poetry from a pre-romantic to romantic state, where you have mimesis being the assumption that's how you're supposed to do democracy, is you imitate the monuments of democracy, and that will somehow bring it forward into the present. But then it's sort of, as you said, when you realize that there's something else out there that you're actually looking at that is getting in the way, then you kind of do something else, which turns out to be the thing you wanted to do in the first place. So what about the form? Assuming that we go further than this poem, and not so much necessarily this particular poem, this poem has really affected me a lot. It's amazing. But this group of fragments has some presence. I mean, people, there are several translations of them, and people find it to be that Hurleyland really speaks to them. So how does that come about? Can you just
in that form?
Pardon?
Form.
Yes.
I was just thinking because it's already fractured. So if it's already fractured, the notion to build a temple is already undone, really.
Yeah, the reason the form kind of.
It's dark. So
Yeah.
we know that's not going to
Yeah, yeah. So the lens that we read this through is a fractured lens. And again, if you thinking of 1803, you do have, and one of the things that's really interesting to note, I think, is that, and I didn't emphasize this in my presentation so much, but a lot of the things that we attribute to experimental modernism, I mean, things we think of like free verse, we think of as modern in the 20th century, but it's not. It just plain isn't. I mean, it goes back into the 18th century, and in the form of, first in the form of the so-called Pindaric Ode of the 18th century. There's a collection, I mentioned this before, there's a collection that is out there hunting for a publisher of essays by various poets and critics in the US and UK. Trying to sort of, thank you again. Which is an attempt to reinforce the point of poems and how contemporary and modern poets have reacted to romanticism, innovative poets. And one of the essays is by Simon Jarvis, who it's a great essay. And it's about the relationship between the 18th century Pindaric Ode and Keston Sutherland's White Hot Andy. And it's really good. So it shows it goes even back before romanticism. But so there's some sense of free verse going on before then, but primarily what's happening in the time that Hölderlin's writing is still a rather formal verse, predictable verse forms, one way or another, whether it's blank verse or stanzaic poetry, rhyme, and so on. And so this sort of is at odds with that.
Pass that around, I forgot. Jeffrey's book. What am I talking?
What was the name of the book with Simon Jarvis?
It's not out yet. We're just putting it together. If it's published, we're trying to get it published in that Contemporary Poetics series at the University of Alabama Press. If you know Charles Bernstein. It will be called Active Romanticism. And it's a weird, interesting collection of essays. Okay, I don't know what you think about continuing, or I think maybe we have enough of these, but if people have other questions, or if we should bring it to a halt, it's up to you.
I think we should have time for any questions if we want to ask them. Otherwise, we'll start to break it up and people can talk to you one-to-one or two-to-one. I think that's probably the best thing. So not to force things, but
Sure. There is a poem in there, by the way, I think it's in there, called The Romantic Subject, which I'd be happy to read if anybody wants to.
why don't we do that?
Anyway, these are poems that are mostly, I guess you'd call them deformations of romanticism, in an attempt, not very theoretically, and they're quite different, but to sort of just sort of spark those poems in different ways, and put them in touch with contemporary idioms, and also in some cases with the language of contemporary poets. I'm not sure if I had it. anyway, what it does briefly is it takes phrases like "I love to" and "I found," and it's a huge list of those phrases, and then they repeat one over and over again. So they attempt to kind of unburden the I of its centrality, I should say.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much.
Very well.